This is a video on how to assemble a bike that's been packed in a Santana Safecase. Now the beauty of the Safecase system is that the individual custom cut foam layers ensure that your bike is safe and secure during travel. However, now that you've arrived in your destination, I'm sure you're eager to get your bike built up and begin exploring the streets. So, we'll show you how to put your bike together quickly and easily. You'll start by laying your Safecase down. Make sure it's on its back. Pop all the hinges open. Now lift it up. You can get your hands in there to make sure it doesn't catch on the tire and pull everything up. Alright. Now simply begin taking out the items and laying them down. You can stack your foam in reverse order so it's easy to get back in. Okay, now that we've got everything out of the case, it's time to turn this pile of parts into a bicycle. Okay, now that we've got the parts out of the box, the first step is to assemble the frame. This is one of our newer frames with the Z couplers, so I'm only going to need a 5mm Allen wrench, 4 on some of the models. If you have an older frame with the S&S couplers, you use that little coupler tool to tighten the connections. We're going to start out by getting the bottom tube in. There's no front or back with this tube. Now we aren't going to fully tighten any of the bolts. We're just going to get everything connected until we've gone around and got all the tubes in. Then we'll come back and tighten them down. We've got the bike laid down on its left side on a smooth surface here to support it. Found something smooth enough that we don't scratch the paint. After the bottom tube, we're going to the lateral tube. This one has the holes for the Stoker's water bottles. The lower ones are down at the bottom. And now for the Stoker's top tube. This bike doesn't have routing for a rim brake, but if it did, you'd want that cable stop to be at the back of the tube. Okay, now that everything is gently connected, I'm going to go back around, get everything snug. Now I'm going to go back around and fully torque. all of the bolts. Okay, now that the frame is fully put together, I'm going to stick the skewers into the wheels and put the wheels on. I'm not going to film that because hopefully you know how to put wheels in a bicycle. Now that your frame is put together and your wheels are on the bike, we're going to put the captain's handlebar on. Now when you disassembled it and put it in the case, you stuck your headset top cap back in here so you wouldn't lose it. So we're going to use a 5mm Allen wrench and take that top cap back off. Now the Santana locking headset collar has kept everything tight and adjusted, so we don't have to worry about your fork falling out and we don't have to readjust your headset. We're merely going to slide the captain's stem on. We're going to put the top cap back in, merely cinching it down so it's not going to wiggle loose. Because the headset's already adjusted, this isn't really accomplishing anything right now. We're going to eyeball from above and get the stem straight with the front wheel. And depending on your model, you'll use either a 4mm or 5mm Allen wrench to tighten the stem. The key here is to alternate back and forth between the bolts. You gradually get them up to a nice even torque. You don't have to go crazy tight here. Now that the stem is straight and tightened down, we can tighten the handlebars. The general position for handlebars is relatively flat. Some people like to tilt them up. It's your preference. But when you tighten them, use the line in the center of the bars to make sure they're centered, and use a star pattern crisscrossing as you tighten the bolts to slowly apply even torque. And you'll also be looking at the gap on the top and the bottom of the stem to make sure that gap is equal. That'll just ensure that all the load is evenly spaced across the handlebar. Again, not super tight on these bolts. You don't want to be crushing your handlebar. Okay, now that the handlebar is on, we're going to reinstall the front brake. That bolt that you stuck back in there so it wouldn't get lost, we'll take it out. Making sure that the front brake cable is the outermost of all the cables. You'll slide the brake onto its post, ensuring that the spring slides into the hole. This particular fork only has one hole, some have 2 or 3. Just make sure you slide the spring into the same hole that the other side's spring is in. Then use your 5mm Allen to tighten the bolt back down that holds the brake caliper on. Now we're going to uncoil and install the other cables. Now I run the rear brake to the outermost, the rear shifter next, and the front shifter to the inside. Now we're going to hook up your rear 3 cables using the barrel adjusters on the bottom of the down tube. We'll start with the front shift cable. It's running innermost of all the other cables across the front of the head tube. It goes across the front and down the right side of the bike. We attach it to the furthest right receiver for the barrel adjusters. Next, we do the rear derailleur. It runs just outside of the front derailleur, across the front of the head tube, and it goes to the middle barrel adjuster receiver. Last, we do the rear brake. It's running outside of those two. The only cable it runs inside of is the front brake. It's going to go across the front of the head tube, and it's going to go to the leftmost barrel adjuster receiver. Okay, now I'll show you to hook up the cable couplers. Now we'll connect the rear section of cables to the front sections. In the back, the rear brake starts on the left side and goes through the left guide. Front derailleur starts in the center, comes through the center guide. Rear derailleur starts on the right and runs through the right guide. Coming up to the front, the rear brake starts on the left side, continues down through the left guide, and makes a straight run to connect with itself in the back. You just thread these couplers together by hand until they meet. The rear derailleur comes down the middle in the front, goes through the middle guide, and I'll grasp the piece of rear derailleur coming from the rear on the right side and join them together. Now I've already double checked the triggers and the shifters to make sure that all the cable is released. Both shifters are shifted to the smallest gear, which is the way they should have been when they went in the box. In the rear, we've got the front derailleur coming from the middle. In the front, we have the front derailleur coming down the left side, going through the left guide, and they'll thread together right here. So this is where the front derailleur and rear derailleur cables cross each other. Okay, we're done with that. Now we're going to install the crank arms. The first thing to take note of, however, is that both left crank arms look the same. However, the captain's arm is 5 millimeters longer than the stoker's. On many cranks, that'll be labeled just above the pedal. If your labeling is rubbed off, you can look at how close the pedal is to the end of the crank. Pedal right by the end, longer crank for the captain. Pedal further up from the end, shorter crank. We'll put that in the back for the stoker. So let's start with the right side captain's crank arm. We're just gonna barely get the bolt started here. You'll notice the axle likes to spin on its own, and that's why once we have the crank just barely hooked up, we'll leave that alone and move over to the other side. Same thing over here. We're just gonna barely get the bolt started so it hangs on there. Now we'll go back to this side. You'll feel there's notches on the crank and notches on the axle, and we wanna make sure those fit together. So as you tighten the bolt, you kind of wiggle it until they fall into place. That's slid most of the way on. Now we'll torque it down. When you tighten these, there's a hard stop at the end. So you want to turn the bolt until you feel that hard stop, and then just give it a tug. We'll come back over here to the left crank. Just gonna get it so it's sitting opposite of the right crank. As we begin tightening the bolt, we're kind of wiggling it to feel that it falls into the notches, and then torquing it down. Okay, now just follow the same method for the rear. Now we'll install and adjust the timing chain. First, I set the timing chain on the stoker's crank, bring it forward, and hang it over the captain's crank. Now the eccentric is already set at the loosest position with the crank at 9 o'clock from when we boxed the bike. Now it's time to line up the two cranks. So, with the stoker crank, the left arm at 9 o'clock, I'll turn the captain's crank to where the right arm looks like it's at 9 o'clock. Hang the chain on, bring it around. Now the eccentric bolts are already loosened. It's either a 3 millimeter or 4 millimeter Allen, depending on what frame material you have. I take my green pin spanner tool, stick it in the holes in the side of the eccentric, and begin rotating the eccentric to the lower position, bringing it down to 7 o'clock or so. Crank arms look like they're synced, nice and flat. I just rotate it forward until I feel just a little wiggle in the chain. You don't want it too tight, You don't want it so flopping loose that it can come off. I feel with my fingers on either side of the eccentric to know that it's centered in the frame. Everything feels good there, so now I can tighten down the 2 pinch bolts. All right, on to the next step. Now this is an optional step. You may have chosen when you boxed the bike to leave your chain on, in which case you just had it wrapped up with a little bit of Velcro foam. Because this bike is equipped with a KMC chain that uses a quick link, or if your bike was equipped with a SRAM chain with a quick link, I chose to take the chain off. It just makes it a little bit neater and cleaner. So now we're going to reinstall the chain. We'll take it and place it over the rear cassette and bring the front part through the front derailleur, grabbing it and bringing it over the small chainring. The part that went over the rear cassette is in the smallest cog. It runs over the top of the front derailleur pulley. It runs above the little slot there, and then behind the lower pulley and out the bottom. Now I can pull it taut at the bottom, press the 2 quick links together, and then as you put tension on the chain, they lock into place. All done. Now we'll install the seat posts and handlebars in the bike. 5mm Allen wrench, drop the Stoker seat post in. Now if you were really thinking before you disassembled the bike, you used a paint pen or a piece of tape to mark the height of the seat posts. When you drop it in, you can put it right where your Stoker likes it. You can also use that same paint pen to mark the handlebars for how far you want the extension pulled out, as well as the tilt of the bar. You just put a little dot of paint between the stem and the bar, and then reline up those dots when you put the bike together. Moving up to the cap and the seat post. You just eyeball from above to make sure it's lined up straight with the frame tubing. Sliding the Stoker stem in. The minimum insertion mark is on the top. You eyeball from behind the bike to make sure that the handlebar is level to the ground, side to side. And as you're tightening the 2 bolts, you work your way back and forth between them to ensure that you're evenly applying torque. Then rotating the bar up to the position that your Stoker likes. Again, if you put the little dot of paint right there, you could easily set it to the same place you had it. Now there's 4 bolts here, and you're going to work in kind of a star pattern to evenly apply torque. And as you're doing it, you'll look at the gap at the top and bottom of the stem clamp to ensure that they're equal. That keeps all the bolts nice and straight. Okay, now your bike is all built up. We're just going to double check the tuning of the brakes and shifting just to be sure everything's good before we go for a ride. The first adjustment that we're going to check after assembling the bike is the front brake. Now nothing was changed on the brake in boxing and unboxing the bike, but it's always good to double check that both pads are equally retracting from the rim, so one's not rubbing. If this pad were rubbing a little, you could tighten the 3mm set screw on this side. That'll pull the brake over this way. If the left pad is rubbing, you can tighten the 3mm spring screw on the left side to pull it over that way. Conversely, you can also loosen either screw to soften the spring on that side. Overall, you're looking for a snappy feel that retracts both pads from the rim without using too much lever effort. All right, that looks good. You can adjust the stroke of the lever with the barrel adjuster right here. If you unscrew the barrel adjuster, it'll tighten the brake, the pads will sit closer to the rim, and the stroke will become shorter. Let's move on to the rear. Now the rear brake shouldn't require any readjustment. It has its own barrel adjuster back here, which is the one that you should have been using to adjust cable tension. So the front barrel adjuster should have been left screwed all the way in which case the boxing and unboxing the bike hasn't changed the adjustment at all. However, you can always double check that the inner fixed pad, which uses a 5mm Allen wrench right here, is adjusted as close to the rotor as it can get without quite rubbing. Then you can feel the stroke at the lever and use the barrel adjuster back here. Unscrewing it will shorten your lever stroke Screwing it in will lengthen the lever stroke. Again, you want to make sure the pad isn't rubbing the rotor. Now moving to the rear derailleur, you'll slowly start shifting up the cog set. If it hesitates to make one of those downshifts, go to this barrel adjuster under the down tube in the middle. Unscrewing the barrel adjuster one click at a time, and then going back and trying to make those downshifts. Unscrewing the barrel adjuster helps it do downshifts. Going back and doing upshifts, if they hesitate, you'll screw the barrel adjuster in to help it do the upshift. Once you have it shifting cleanly in both directions in the back, you'll move up to the front derailleur. Shifting from the small ring to the middle ring, if it hesitates to make that shift, you'll come up to your front barrel adjuster, the one on the far right side of the bike, and unscrew it a couple of clicks. Then go down and try to shift from the middle ring to the big ring. Go all the way down to your smallest cog in the back. You're now in your tallest gear, and check that the chain isn't rubbing the outer derailleur plate. If it is, you'll unscrew this front derailleur barrel adjuster a few more clicks until it has enough tension to hold the derailleur out and not rub the chain. Now go through and just run it through all the gears. Make sure it cleanly shifts in both directions in the front. And you're done, ready to ride.